Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on person-centered planning, the role of tailored plans in supporting the practice standards of the North Carolina PCP guidance document. My name is Mark Romaldi, and I am a Human Service Program Manager at the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Use Services. Thank you for joining us today to explore the ways we can partner with providers when developing and approving the PCP. At this time, I'd like to pass it back over to Dr. Janice Tandora with the Yale Program for Recovery and Community Health.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark, and thank you for your support of this initiative. I will tell you a little bit more about myself and my background in a minute, but first I want to cover some key housekeeping items, starting with how you qualify for your NBCC Certificate of Completion. My colleague Ingrid is going to drop a little document into the chat box for you that gives you all the ins and outs of how you get that certificate. But the basics are, you do have to participate in the full duration of the event. You need to use the unique link that was sent to you to log in today. If for some reason you're logging in from an alternate device like an iPhone, or you're switching back and forth between devices, please attach your name and your email address in the chat box for us so we can match you up to the email registration address that you have. We also have to have you do a post-event training survey within 2 weeks of today's event. It's short and it's sweet. We're going to give you a QR code and a link at the end of today's presentation. Hopefully many of you will just take care of it as we're logging off. But again, please do that within about 2 weeks. And then give us about 1 month before you reach out to us about your certificates, and check your spam box before you reach out. Occasionally, it will go to a junk email box. It comes from a sender called Certifier. That's where your NBCC certificate will go to. But if after a month you haven't received it, you can, again, message my colleague Ingrid, and Ingrid's email is right up there on the screen. So a couple of other just housekeeping items for smooth operations today. We have muted folks to reduce any of the audio interference. Please do have access to your chat box. We're going to be doing some exercises that I'm going to need to get some input from you there. Also, welcome questions or observations in the chat box. I'm going to try to save a couple of minutes at the end, but also some of colleagues who are on the line today may be responding to questions in the chat as we go today. So even though we're in the virtual world, I do hope to make this as interactive as possible. So let me just tell you a little bit about my background. Oh, one more housekeeping item before I forget. People start asking pretty quickly, will we get a copy of the slides? And I do want to confirm that yes, usually within a couple of days, you will get a copy of not only the slides, but a recording of today's event. And we do know that there were some conflicts in the schedule, and not everyone who wanted to attend was able to. So you will get the slides and the recordings. And as you're going to see throughout the webinar, we're going to drop some different resources into the chat box for you. And then when you get the slides, there'll be some hyperlinks in them as well. And then I am, sitting at a kitchen table desk here, and I have a great internet connection, but I always tell audiences, if for some reason we were to get disconnected, please just give it a second and log back on, and we'll dive right back in. But everything looks good on my end. So I am a clinical psychologist by training. I started out my career in the broader disability independent living movement because I have a close family member who sustained a severe traumatic brain injury in a motor vehicle accident over 30 years ago. And he struggled mightily in his recovery and was living in a wide variety of institutional settings because of his injuries. And then ultimately, it was a special waiver program based on person-centered planning that helped him to rebuild his life in the community. So I became very passionate about person-centered planning and found myself back at graduate school And ultimately, I shifted on over, primarily in recent years, I've been working more within the behavioral health field, supporting people living with a range of different serious mental illnesses and behavioral health disorders. And I do a lot of work around the country in a variety of states, but also at the federal level with SAMHSA and the Administration for Community Living. I'm really trying to translate what are oftentimes abstract philosophical concepts around strengths-based, person-centered, et cetera, into actual practice guidelines. What do we kind of do more of, less of, differently when we sit down and we co-create a plan with a person or a family? So I'm very passionate about this work from both a personal and a professional perspective. And I'm not the only expert in the room. I really want to acknowledge that, right? Which is that North Carolina has been hard at work with person-centered planning for many years. Some of you may have extensive training yourselves, so please feel free to chime in with questions, responding to questions in the chat box. We certainly welcome that. And then finally, I will just say that for anyone, if we have visual impairments for accessibility purposes, again, my name's Janice. I'm a white woman wearing glasses with light brown hair pulled back in a bun today, sitting in front of a blue background. So again, welcome. It is great to have you here. And now I'm going to have Ingrid open a poll for us, which is going to be very helpful for me to get a sense of where you're starting. So back in 2022-23, there was an introductory person-centered planning training that was offered in a series of live webinars. That same intro training is now available on Behavioral Health Springboard. And I'd like to know how many of you have actually taken that introductory PCP training on BHS. So if you can go ahead and let me know, that would be great. And if you have not taken it, but maybe you've taken other intensive person-centered planning training, let me know that in chat so I can get a sense of where everyone's starting. I'll give this. Okay, great. All right. The other thing that you can do while colleagues are continuing to respond here is if you could put your role into the chat box, that's going to, again, help me kind of get oriented to who's with us today. We have some people who may be wearing sort of their hat and doing some chart reviews. You may be a consultant supporting the state. You may be someone who's working directly with the Transition to Community Living initiative. So again, let us know in chat. And Ingrid, you can go ahead and close the poll and share the results for me. All right, so we have, a good portion of you, 71% of you have taken that training, either live or through BHS. 29% have yet to take it. So what I will say to you is that in addition to supporting the expectations as laid out in the North Carolina PCP guidance document, completion of that BHS PCP training actually unlocks some really wonderful resources for you that I'm going to tell you about in a minute, because we've built a very rich online PCP toolkit that you can access after you've done the introductory training. So I'll tell you a bit more about that in a minute. Let me just briefly say, and most of you are probably aware of this history, that PCP in North Carolina dates back all the way to the early 90s and probably even prior to that. But back in the 90s, with a Thomas S. class action suit, really focused on moving people with disabilities out of institutional settings into more integrated community settings, and then building off of that effort. There was a wide variety of training and resources that have been offered over the last 20, 30 years. And in addition to that, the mental health recovery movement helped to sort of catapult some of our systems of care into these directions. So there was a lot of progress that had been made, but then also some of the ongoing reviews of the PCPs that were being done indicated that there was more progress still to be had. And in response to that, a really diverse multi-stakeholder group came together and they updated the North Carolina PCP guidance document. And then, in an effort to help all the stakeholders in the field to meet the expectations in that guidance document, we did that widespread intro training back in 2022, 23. We're continuing to offer a series of webinars like this one to key stakeholder groups. And also the state really recognizes that you all need to have tools and resources in your hands to really optimize your PCP practice. So to that end, something that we did in the past year, I just want to, again, make sure that you're aware of this, is that we built a really rich, comprehensive online PCP resource toolkit. You see at the bottom of the screen there, you will have a link. In order to access this toolkit, you have to have taken that introductory training. So for, again, the 30% or so of you that haven't done that yet, definitely check it out. It's got great information. Then you can access this toolkit. What we did in this toolkit was that I worked with a group of different subject matter experts, including people with lived experience. And essentially, we gathered the best of the best resources from all of our travels all around the country, including some of North Carolina's own sort of homegrown local resources. And we've organized them in this really user-friendly online toolkit. So you can search by topic, you can search by disability, population, and focus. And it has everything from research articles to recorded webinars to brief facts and tip sheets. So again, just encourage you to check it out. It's a nice resource. Now I'm going to get you a little bit active here, as I had said, and I just want to get us going with a quick little opening exercise. And the first thing I want you to do in your chat box is that I want you to think about, how do we traditionally define improvement for people who are living with serious disabilities? So people living with serious mental illnesses, brain injury, might be intellectual disability. I'm giving you permission to take off your person-centered hat for a minute, right? So traditionally, what do we value as markers of improvement? And go ahead and put that in the chat. I'll get us going. So I probably do hundreds, if not thousands of chart reviews in a year. And historically, we focus a lot on things like achieve and maintain clinical stability, medication compliance. Okay, here we go. Yeah, symptom management, reduction of symptoms, focusing on activities of daily living, right, Wendy? So is a person showering, taking care of themselves, taking care of their apartment? Are they having reduced problematic behaviors? We focus historically a lot on risk management. We might be looking at how they're maintaining their housing. How about where don't we want people to go? Historically, we want them to stay out of where? Yeah, adult care homes, hospitals, jails, off the streets, exactly. All right, how about how someone thinks about, say that they're living with a mental illness diagnosis. Historically, we want people, when they think about their illness, we want them to have increased what? It begins with an I. For those of you that may work in that arena. How somebody, yeah, insight, right, Joy, right? We want people to have insight in reality testing. Okay, all right, leave that there for a moment. Have access to your chat box. But now what I want you to do is take off your professional hat, put on your personal hat as a human being. And into the chat box, I just want you to spontaneously write down the 3 most important things in your own life personally. The 3 things that give your life meaning, what puts a smile on your face, why you get out of bed in the morning. 3 most important things personally. family and friends and fun, peace, my job, right? A sense of giving back, my health, recreation, pets, right? I always say that those are the furry and feathered family. Service work, giving back, traveling, being able to make my own decisions, having some security, faith, however I experience that, whether it's on my own or with a spiritual community in an organized parish, right? My daughter, my son, being a good mom, okay, right? Excellent. Okay, so here's what I want you to notice. The first observation in this exercise. When I asked you to think about what do we traditionally value as markers of improvement or outcomes for people with serious disabilities, a lot of times we're focused very heavily on that first list on the left-hand side. But then on the right-hand side, when I asked you to think about what do you value in your own life personally, what gives your life meaning, you got a list that looked much more like the list on the right. So anybody want to put some comments in the chat? What do you notice about the difference between these two lists? Because they're pretty different. And I'm curious to hear what you notice about them. Go ahead and put an observation in chat. Yeah, the one on the left, right, Elsa? It's very impersonal. It's kind of cold. It's sort of detached. Yeah. What else? Yeah, second list, it's much more personal. It just speaks to a person's heart, right? Yeah, so the left side of the list is very clinical. Let me make a caveat here because that comes up a lot. It is more clinical in terms of using jargon and whatnot, but I also want to send the message early on that clinical is not a bad word in the person-centered world. There's absolutely an appropriate, really important place for good quality clinical care, okay? But the observation is that that list feels very narrow and impersonal in that sense, like it has a lot of jargon in it. It's a lot about societal norms, right? What we expect of people, right, Patricia, okay? So on the right, again, is what speaks to people's hearts. It's the reason they get out of bed in the morning. And then the last piece of this little opening exercise is that I want you to imagine, whether you wrote it in the chat or on a piece of paper, just imagine for one moment that Janice Tondora is crossing off the second thing on your list. And I'm taking out or delaying that thing in your life right now. So imagine that I cross one off. And then tell me in the chat, how would that feel for you to not be able to experience that thing in your life? What's the emotional reaction? How does it feel in your gut? Yeah, not happy, sad, devastated, depressing, anxious, intrusive, disappointing, just completely lost sense of meaning, hopeless and angry. Yeah, so angry, lonely, okay? So I want you to think about that and that feeling that you have in your gut to imagine your life without that thing in it. And then I just want to pose to you something to really think about. We have made a lot of progress in service planning in the last 20, 25 years, especially in the last 5 years. However, people who have serious disabilities still tell me in my travels around the country that the moment of treatment planning is a place where they go every 3 months or every 6 months. And someone in the room other than them has the power to decide what 2 things end up being the focus of that plan and what one thing gets crossed off. Okay. So let me be very clear. Nobody goes into this business to cross off anything off of anybody's list, right? I think people have big hearts by and large, right? And we want to help people live good lives. But nonetheless, we still have some barriers as it relates to treatment planning that we tend to default back to the very sort of narrow, professionally driven goals. And just to give you one example, I do a lot of work in residential settings. So you might refer to them as adult care homes. And, you know, people are saying like, before I die, the one thing I really want is a key to my own apartment. I want to live in an apartment in the community. And I still sit in treatment planning meetings where people get the message, we know that's important to you, but until you've been med compliant for at least 6 months, we're not comfortable initiating the referral to supported housing. So in that moment, the home of one's own, the apartment in the community, gets delayed and crossed off the list with a very singular focus on the medication or the treatment compliance, okay? That's not to say that, effectively using meds or treatment isn't an important part of the plan, but we don't want it to be the dominant and exclusive focus and crowd out what is most important to people in their lives, which is the same stuff that is important to all of you as human beings, the kinds of things on the right-hand side of the list. So again, we're making progress, but we still have a ways to go. And it's part of why we're continuing with the webinar series to really try to send consistent messages out in the field that at the end of the day, whether people are living with a mental health diagnosis, a developmental disability, a brain injury, a substance use concern, folks want the same things out of life as the rest of us. They want to thrive, right? They don't just want to survive in, an illness or a health condition. And person-centered planning is one really powerful tool to help us do that. So I just wanted to place this in some context for you. From the perspective of North Carolina, I've referred previously to the North Carolina Person-Centered Planning Guidance document, and much of what we're coaching today, right? It all directly aligns to support that. In addition, this model of person-centered planning that we have been teaching both in process and documentation, it should help the state as stakeholders work together. It should help you respond around some of the observations from your Department of Justice settlement agreement, okay? Because while there has been some progress made in those areas, PCP continues to really be a trouble spot, and they're continuing to observe kind of cut and paste, kind of copied, formulaic goal statements on plans, and they're struggling to really see people's voices, right? And how their voice is emerging in the plan so that we're certain in the co-creation of that critical document that their voice and choice is being honored, okay? So North Carolina is not alone in those struggles. This is a struggle for a variety of reasons, pretty much in every state. I've done the work around the country. And at the national level, reviews that CMS has done in their heightened scrutiny visits of the Home and Community-Based Services Program observe the same struggles, that it's really hard to see where and how people are actively participating in and driving their plan. It's not clear what is really important to people, right, in terms of their quality of life and long-term vision. And there's not a lot of evidence of different choices being offered. And sometimes that work is happening, but it's not showing up in our documentation, which is kind of a key issue, which is why we're going to focus on that today and what that looks like. For those of you who want to take a deeper dive on this, because of the continued difficulties with moving PCP from theory to practice, national organizations like SAMHSA, you see the screenshot on the PowerPoint screen there, they have started to release kind of critical guidance documents to the field. The one that you're looking at here, and your slides when you get them will have a link to it, is an issue brief that I wrote for SAMHSA back in 2024, so very recent, that offers really comprehensive guidance for organizational and state leadership around the kinds of things that are necessary at a systems level to support the implementation of this practice. And that PCP issue brief is chock full of tremendous resources and hyperlinks. So again, just want to make sure we're getting those things into your hands, okay? So let's talk about the struggle in moving from theory to practice. There's a lot of reasons why we have a hard time making that leap, but this one is really paramount among them, I would say. And many of you may feel like this, or the providers you support may feel like this, like caught squeezed between a rock and a hard place. Because on the one hand, we're talking about, in the spirit of PCP, being collaborative and strengths-based, person-centered, sharing, wide variety of resources and information with people. But on the other hand, you have all these people chasing you around with red pens, right? Or maybe you're a person who even has to do the chasing with the red pen, and you're struggling in your brain how to figure out, how do we balance the person-centered spirit and honoring the person with also satisfying the chart in the variety of functions that that plan has to play, which includes meeting regulations, required paperwork, maintaining what we call your golden thread of medical necessity to justify services, okay? So we understand that you oftentimes are trying to juggle these seemingly incompatible pressures. I wouldn't do this work if I didn't think that we could marry, right, both professional expertise along with the wisdom of lived experience in one good quality plan, okay? So taking a closer look at some of the details here, this is just a big picture model of person-centered planning as a whole, starting with, the philosophy that people can and do recover, they can and should have maximum choice in their service planning. That influences a different way of relating to people, interviewing, conversations, meeting facilitation. That's the green part. Then that different kind of philosophy and different kind of interpersonal process informs what often looks like a very different written plan, whether that's on paper or in an electronic health record. That's the golden part. And then finally, remember, we're doing this for a more aspirational purpose, not just surviving and staying out of the hospital or out of the institution, but about building that good life and thriving in the community. And PCP is a really big part of that. The arrow is there because in my experience, we oftentimes carry the spirit of PCP in our hearts, and we may even think it in our brains, and in our interactions with people, we may be living it. But a lot of times where the quality breaks down is when you try to jump from the green to the gold. And people really struggle to figure out, again, how do you write a plan that honors the person first and foremost, but it also satisfies the chart and all of the other requirements you have. So we are going to take a deeper dive into all of that in the time we have together today. But I would be remiss if I did not reiterate before we go further. Yes, we're focusing on the documentation because all of you play a really critical role in supporting providers around this. Many of you are doing chart reviews yourselves. So we are going to focus on that. But please, again, remember the quality of that plan is only as good as the process and the relationship behind it, okay? So what you have on the screen here, and Ingrid's going to put this resource in the chat for you. This is a brief couple-page handout, part of our recovery roadmap series. That's tips for recognizing a good person-centered process. Like if we sit down and facilitate, whether it's a one-on-one PCP meeting or whether it's a team-based PCP meeting, how do you know if that's really person-centered? What does it look like? How does it look a little different? And this is a really nice tip sheet that people have found helpful. And we just wanted to give that to you to, again, reiterate, you can cross the T's and dot the I's in your PCPs and they can look good on paper. But the most critical thing is that the process underneath it is really authentically based on a quality person-centered relationship with mutual respect, shared decision-making, okay? So this is just a slide that I think illustrates what I was saying. I'm the eternal optimist and really do believe that we can pull together in one good quality PCP, honor what is really important to people in their lives, but at the same time, make sure that we're doing our professional due diligence and offering our expertise around some of the health and disability related needs that might be important for them to attend to as they move forward in their lives and in their recovery. But how we do that in the plan and where these things get documented might look a little different, okay? So let me start big picture here. The biggest single shift in this logic model of documenting is that traditional treatment plans get organized like that list on the left-hand side there. They're organized around the problem list. So historically, what we do in health and social disability services is we go through our assessment, paperwork, our conversations, and then we say, okay, for every problem that scored X or higher on the assessment, we're going to tag a goal onto it. So then you end up with PCPs that look like this on the left. Well, you have assaultive problematic behavior. What's your goal for your problematic behavior? Well, you have poor hygiene. You're struggling with your self-care. What's your goal for your hygiene? You know, you have auditory hallucinations. You have voices. What's your goal around your experience of psychosis? Okay. So you can see how pretty quickly the plan gets carved up, completely organized around a deficit-based model, okay? And I don't know about you all, but I would not get very jazzed about working that plan in my life, that one on the left-hand side, because I don't necessarily see the things in it that really speak to me and my heart and my motivation, right? So in contrast, on the right-hand side, we have much more person-centered, goal-oriented method of documenting. So we start at the top, we find out what's most important to the person. And maybe they want to get their job back so they can provide for their family, for their kids, right? Many of you, when you put your list in the chat, a job, financial independence, right? Those were critical to you as well, okay? So if that's the person's long-term goal, then we start thinking, okay, well, what did we learn from the assessment and our conversations together? What's getting in the way of you getting your job back? Well, maybe you had some physical conflicts with your coworkers in the past and you got fired, right? You kind of lost your cool and they let you go. Maybe you are struggling with your self-care and your appearance, and it's going to be difficult for you to put your best foot forward in a job interview. Or maybe in the past, when you had your job, you really struggled with absenteeism because you were using substances and you called out kind of chronically, so you got let go. So what you can hopefully start to see is that we can stay true to that goal that's most important to people without neglecting the things that are related to their health or disability that might be getting in the way. So that's the model that we're going to walk through together, okay? So this is a big picture perspective. We're going to take each of these piece by piece. I'm going to give you a couple of tips, a definition, some quality flaws that we tend to see, and some examples. And then for each of the bluish colored ones, we're going to reflect on an example of someone that we call Jerry. And you're going to have an opportunity after I do some of the coaching and the didactic to vote through our interactive polls. If you were co-creating a plan with Jerry, what do you think his long-term goal might be? Okay. So just to further orient you, if you have not seen this, this is the suggested PCP template that is a part of the official North Carolina guidance document. You can see I have a little arrow up at the top because we're going to start with that long-term goal statement. But then you see as the template progresses, you have a space for your short-term goal. And then finally, interventions and how everyone works together to help the person achieve their short and long-term goals. So reminder that this template, if you are using this template, it is built in a way that it really should help you to meet the expectations of the PCP guidance document. But again, this is not required, but it's a suggested template, and many people have found it helpful in the field, okay? All right, and Ingrid or Mark, if you happen to see anything in the chat that I should stop and respond to, please let me know. Otherwise, we'll try to revisit any questions at the end, okay? So starting at the top, really everything should start with and flow from that valued person-centered planning long-term goal statement. Okay, these are the things that reflect the important to the individual. Same kinds of things that you put your list of 3 in the chat box this morning. And it's really critical that we start here because we have a tendency in service fields and in health fields, we have a tendency to jump right in and start thinking about, you know, really what does a person need and what kinds of services are we going to connect them to? But you really can't understand what a person needs until you first understand and have a real appreciation for what it is that they want out of their life, okay? Because the kinds of services you might offer them could look different. If a person wants to live in their own apartment, or they want to get a job back, or they want to have custody of their kids. So exploring that bigger picture as a starting point of PCP is really critical. So in the PCP, just to be very clear here, because there's a lot of confusion in the field sometimes, you have two levels of goals. The first level of the goal is the longer term goal, okay? We're going to talk a little bit later about a shorter term goal, which some of you might refer to as an objective. Short-term goal and objective, those terms get used interchangeably, okay? But we're starting with the long-term goal. Long-term goals should be meaningful life changes, quality of life oriented, their desirable daily routine. Do they want to go to church? Do they want to have some friends? Does somebody want to volunteer in the community? Okay. You do not want them to only be limited to the management of clinical symptoms, behavioral issues, disability issues, okay? We're going to have lots of other places in the plan to address that. But at the level of this long-term goal, you want this ideally to be something that is a quote, an I statement that comes directly from the individual about what's important to them in their life. Ideally, you want it to be something they're moving toward and not just something that they're getting rid of, okay? So if a person says to you, for example, I'm so depressed, I can't get out of bed. I just want to be less depressed. Then you have to be a partner in that process, right? Because that's just a goal of reducing depression, okay? To get to a more forward-thinking, long-term, person-centered goal, you have to have the conversation with the individual. If you were less depressed, what would your life look like? What would you be doing differently? Would you be getting out of bed to go read at your kid's kindergarten class? Would you be having a cup of coffee with a neighbor? What would you actually be doing? Okay. In many cases, that long-term goal also reflects commonly expressed desire for people to have more independence and self-determination, whether that's around where they live, who they love, how they manage their medications or their money. Many people express a desire to have more control over those things in their life. I said many, but not all, right? Because there are individual and also very important cultural differences around some of those values of independent decision-making, okay? But typically, these are the kinds of long-term goals that you want to see on your PCPs, right? I want to finish school, want to move out and get my own place. Maybe I want to join a hiking club. So these are, again, quotes and their I statements. What I want people to observe here, the question always comes up. People say, yeah, but those aren't SMART goals, okay? So we are going to apply the SMART criteria, but it's applied at the level of the short-term goal, also sometimes called an objective. So by starting here, you want the long-term goal to be free, to be organic and spontaneous, to just come from the person, right? What's their most valued goal? What role do they want to play in their life? And then a little bit later, when we start talking about, well, what are going to be the first steps forward? Then we're going to make sure and be crystal clear to hit those SMART criteria. And I'll do some coaching around that as well. So SMART criteria at the level of the short-term goal. Here, you want this to be directly from the person, okay? And this is consistent with how this is all laid out in the North Carolina Person-Centered Planning document, okay? Let me just see. I'm just checking chat here to see. Okay. So Paul is asking a question about sometimes providers, they create a long-term goal for each short-term goal, right? Or it's like long-term goal, short-term objective, long-term goal, short-term objective. And somebody may have like 4 or 5 long-term goals, and then each one has an objective, a shorter-term goal, and then a set of interventions. And then lo and behold, you have a 10-page plan that's not feasible to write, but it's also not feasible for a person to necessarily work in their life. It's maybe too much at one time. So what I would say to that is that Paul is asking the question, shouldn't there just be one long-term goal, right? And then maybe the other short-term goals can come underneath that. So I don't ever have a hard and fast rule because, again, this is person-centered planning, and it may be the case for one person. Maybe they have two long-term goals because maybe they want to have a better relationship with their kids, but they also want to get an apartment of their own. And those are qualitatively kind of different. But Paul, you're absolutely right that you can often do some integrating. So you may have one sort of overarching long-term goal and then a number of short-term goals underneath it. And I'll give you lots of examples of that as we move forward, okay? But to be clear, at the level of the long-term goal, this is what we're moving away from, right? We don't want the long-term goals on PCPs to be about hygiene. Nobody's goal in life is to shower 3 times a week, okay? Improving self-care and showering a certain number of times might be an important part of a PCP. If a person, for example, is, again, I want to go back to work, and I got to present well in job interviews, okay? But at the level of the long-term goal, we want to be moving away from these kinds of things. We want to be consistently thinking about get a job, volunteer, connect with friends, spiritual interests, hobbies, whatever it might be. So sometimes people like to see the contrast, what you see on the left versus on the right. So we want to be moving away from the kinds of long-term goals you see on the left and moving toward the ones on the right. Quotes, forward-thinking, person-centered vision of life, okay? Whether that's, you know, in a school system, in a community, you name it, okay? Not everyone can do this on their own, and sometimes you have to dig a little deeper. Sometimes people, all they need is the invitation to then offer you up that long-term person-centered goal statement. Other times you may have to ask some of these follow-up questions and be a good partner in all of this to do some clarification, to make sure that you're clear on exactly what is important to people so that you can land on the best long-term goal statement, okay? So same kind of example as I gave before. If somebody just says to you, I just want the voices to be quiet, right? To turn that around into a more forward-thinking, long-term goal statement. If your voices were quiet, what would you be able to do differently? What could you do with your life that you're not doing now? How would your daily routine look different? Okay. So just kind of giving you some examples here about how you can kind of dig a little deeper. And reminders that this can be an intimidating process, right? Because setting goals, people can get anxious, whether you have a disability or not, people can get anxious because then what if I don't meet my goals, right? It feels like there's a little bit of pressure in that. So even the word goal setting can be intimidating to people. So just be thinking about different ways that you might ask the question. So I think, for example, we do a lot of work with peer specialists. And years ago in one of our projects, someone was having a very hard time coming up with a long-term goal statement. And they had some interest in the vocational arena, but was, again, struggling to articulate something. And one of our peer specialists just said to the person, think back to before you went into that first hospitalization. Think back to when you were younger, before the struggles. What did you dream of being when you grew up? And why did you like that thing? And it was just a really creative question, a way to sort of mentally put that person kind of back in that moment to recapture that sense of excitement about it. So it can be really helpful to reframe the question. If a person's really struggling, don't forget about those natural supporters. Who else is in the person's life? A family member, a friend, a neighbor, somebody that they may have invited into their PCP process. And they might be able to tell you what a vision of a better life looks like for a person. Sometimes people can't articulate those things because they're intimidated or they might be struggling with really severe depression. But also people may just not have the ability to use verbal language to communicate, in which case you have to continue to be really creative and think about supports, natural support observations, or even your own observations. You get to know people, you know them closely, you have a sense of their likes and their dislikes. So it's okay for you to offer observations if a person is struggling. I mean, I think about, again, work in residential settings, and someone who was really severely isolated, almost never coming out of their room at the group home, really not engaging in care in any way. And then a residential coordinator, the house manager, got called in on a weekend unexpectedly and had to cover the residents, and brought their dog to the residents. They didn't have anybody to watch their dog. And sure enough, that resident who had been spending, 20 hours a day in their room suddenly was out of the room, was down in the kitchen, was brushing the dog, wanted to feed the dog, wanted to walk the dog. And it was a kind of engagement that people in that program really hadn't seen before. So it was something as simple as that observation that led them to those deeper conversations, really uncovering this person's love of animals, the fact that they might want to volunteer at a local animal shelter in some way. And it really served as a catalyst to help that person move forward, okay? So hopefully what you're picking up on here, the reason we spend such a long time on the long-term goal statements is that they are really critical in their exploration, because they're an opportunity for you to join together with the person in a place of hope, or to hold hope for people when they may have lost it for themselves. And Brad, who may be on the line with us somewhere, we have a big group today, but shared this research with me recently. I wasn't familiar with it. It's ACORN research. It's Collaborative Outcomes Resource Network. And they've done really large scale outcomes research in the behavioral health space. And over again, what they found really predicts successful outcomes is not the particular intervention or the therapeutic modality. It fundamentally comes back to these 3 bullets on the screen, right? Do I feel like my provider genuinely likes me? Do I feel like they genuinely have some hope for me in my future that things can change? And do I trust them enough to kind of hang on to that hope myself and have my own confidence? So fundamentally, it really comes back to the quality of the relationship. I just think it's really important to reiterate that. Part of how we build the relationship, especially if people are stuck in this goal setting process and struggling to kind of come up with that bigger person-centered vision, is to just use all the tools that you have available to you to inspire hope and goal setting. And my colleague Ingrid is going to drop some of these sample tools into the chat right now, for those of you want to download them. For those of you that have taken the BHS intro training, remember we have that very rich online toolkit that has not only these tools, but a plethora of other tools around strengths-based assessment and goal setting, okay? So in addition to offering you some tools in the chat box, you have some great tools of your own already, right? Including some really nice stuff that exists within your InReach tool, that your peer specialists are using in your TCL initiative. So you can see, in particular, the later pages of that TCL InReach tool really try to dig down to get a sense of like, what is most important to people? Do they love taking care of their hair and appearance? Do they want to go to school? What do they want their daily routine to look like? And this just offers you, again, some kind of follow-up questions that you can ask people. So remember to use the tools that you have available at your disposal, not just your InReach tool for those of you that are involved in TCL, but for those of you who may be using, or providers are using, that suggested PCP template that's in the guidance document. There's some great, important questions in there that help you tap that area. So let's do this. I'm going to introduce you to this story of someone called Jerry so that we can keep moving on, get through our final components. And we're going to vote on a couple of the key elements, okay? we're going to vote on our long-term goal, our short-term goal or objective, and our intervention. But just to give you a snapshot of the story, Jerry was a 42-year-old single white man. He had a diagnosis of disorganized schizophrenia. He had many lengthy hospitalizations, years in number, but was currently living in a what you would refer to as kind of an adult care home. And he had 24/7 supervision and supports. And he also had a lot of strength to draw upon. He was very well liked by his peers. He had a great sense of humor. He had a supportive brother that was local and involved. Jerry could tell you what he liked and what his interests were. He loved music. He loved Chinese restaurants and food and culture. Years ago, he used to love to go to music festivals on the green, but especially recently, he's gotten super distressed, especially when he's out in public navigating the community, because he's oftentimes afraid that other people might hurt him. And he's getting very isolated and almost never leaving the adult care home other than to come, to appointments at the mental health center. He didn't know if he's feeling kind of like a zombie, and reporting a lot of lethargy. He didn't know if that was symptoms of his diagnosis or if it was maybe something going on with his medications. But more so than anything, Jerry was lonely. He was a 42-year-old single guy. He wanted a girlfriend more than anything. He wanted to start dating again, but he was afraid. He didn't know where to start, feeling overwhelmed by it. He wasn't currently able to take the bus to get out and about in the community. I mean, he was really afraid to go anywhere because he would both get confused at times, and also he might at times be afraid that someone else might hurt him. So when you think about Jerry's snapshot, let's imagine for a moment that Jerry had a TCL InReach tool. So I just kind of mocked one up here to give you a sense of how that might play out in this one-page profile, right? So you see on the left-hand side there, these are some great things about me that I want you to know as we develop the PCP. And these are some of the things that other folks would say about me, okay? And then on the right-hand side, trying to dig a little bit deeper in certain areas from his living situation to his money situation, to his medical situation around what's most important to me. And then down the bottom on the right-hand side, you see it goes a little deeper into strengths, interests, community activities, and hobbies. And again, this interest in being social and kind of dating again, because he was hoping to have a girlfriend. So let's do this. Let's open our first poll. Ingrid, if you can open up the Jerry, we're talking about the long-term goal statement. So if you can identify, what do you think would be the best long-term goal statement? I'll give you a few more seconds. All right, Ingrid, if you can go ahead and close it and share. We have a majority of people who have responded. Okay, so we have got a little bit of a mix here, but we have two that are tied for the front runner. We have I want a girlfriend and I just want to be happy. Okay, so for those of you that chose I want a girlfriend, I would say that according to the criteria that I was just walking you through, that would be the most ideal long-term person-centered goal statement to organize Jerry's plan around, because he has consistently told you over and over, I'm lonely, I want somebody to share my life with, okay? The reason I just want to be happy is not the best choice. It's a quote and it's positive, but we have very little sense of what makes Jerry happy just in that goal statement. And if you were to ask Jerry, So what would make you happy? He would tell you a date on a Friday night. Okay. So you want a little bit more specificity in your long-term goal statement. Okay. I don't want to feel like a zombie. It's a quote, but again, that's getting rid of something negative. And if he didn't feel like a zombie, what would he be doing? He'd be more social. He'd maybe be dating again, getting out in the community. Okay. The second one could be an important part of the plan, but remember, at the level of the long-term goal, you want to think quality of life oriented. You don't want to just think about managing symptoms. We're going to tackle that kind of stuff at the level of the short-term goal. And then finally, the blue one is not a long-term goal, okay? He could attend social skills group twice a week for the next 20 years and never get a date on a Friday night. Social skills group is an intervention, okay? That comes later. At this level, we want to go with what's most motivating to him. And he's lonely. He wants a partner, okay? So I want a girlfriend is where we want to go with that one, okay? All right, I'm not going to go through all the slides. There's a lot in here. I'll skip a few, make a couple of brief remarks. So I want to make sure we get through all of our polls today. So let's talk first about strengths and barriers, right? So now you have this long-term vision of where the person wants to go, right? Quality of life oriented. Then we want to cast the net broad and think about strengths, interests, both inside the person, but also available in their natural support community, whether that's a family community, a spiritual community, a cultural community, neighborhood community. It could be a character trait. It could be a previous accomplishment. So we always say to cast the net broad, but to do that with an eye toward ultimately you want to not just identify the strengths, you want to capitalize on them in the plan. It's so sad to me because I'll sit in PCP meetings or read a chart review. And sometimes providers have done just a beautiful job exploring strengths and listing them and filling out that part of the paperwork. But then when I actually read the PCP, you don't see the strengths actually show up in any concrete way. So what I'm offering you here are just some examples. If you have somebody who is a big animal lover, but they've been struggling with their weight, maybe they have diabetes because of their medications, maybe they won't walk regularly for themselves for fitness, but maybe if they got a dog, they would walk the dog regularly. So it's just one way to kind of use that love of animals to get a person moving, okay? Or a person who is thinking about suicide or having thoughts about suicide. You may be offering your very best medication management supports, your very best individual therapy, peer support. But in addition to that, if it's a person who is deeply spiritual and that's a big part of their life and their coping, then maybe they want to get some guidance from a spiritual director or read scripture. And this one is just an example. Again, thank you to Brad who offered this to me, Brad Owens. It's a really nice example. And this will be, again, full slides that you'll get. So don't worry about the small font on the screen. But just an example that sometimes in our dialogue and interviewing, we don't go down certain trails because we don't see how they're going to get us to a treatment plan, okay? But this starts with goal discovery, with just authentic human curiosity. So if Jerry tells you, as he repeatedly did tell me back in the day, he's based on a real story, that he loves Chinese restaurants. And, he's like, yeah, it's good stuff. Well, what's your favorite? Well, I love the Kung Pao chicken. It is like sweet hot. Yeah, man, there's a really good restaurant 20 minutes away with awesome, Kung Pao. Oh, I don't have $50 for a cab and Chinese food. Well, maybe I can help you look it up online. We can check it out, see how much it costs, maybe even read reviews, see some other places that are around. And, there's different ways that we can look up how to get a bus pass or schedule some on-demand rides that are safe and convenient for you. So something that starts with a love of Chinese restaurants or egg rolls, which Jerry loved egg rolls, it can lead you, right? If you follow that, it can lead you to very concrete, legitimate areas that are in need of attention for somebody to enjoy community inclusion. Their community mobility, being able to access transportation, How do we use the internet to search different things? How do we go about our shopping so that we're doing okay on a fixed budget? So just giving you some examples here about how to follow up on those things. So for those of you who might be wondering, with all this talk about strengths-based, forward-thinking goal discovery, where do we actually tackle the problems and how do we support our payment for services? So we're going to shift because there's lots of other places you need to be thinking about supporting your medical necessity. And it just may show up in different places in the plan. So the problems or the functional needs, again, we don't necessarily want those to show up in the long-term goal, but we're going to see them, for example, in the barriers field. And again, we're going to tackle them in the short-term goals. So with your barriers, and you may call these different things, depending on what systems your providers use, problem list, functional impairments, and screens. But essentially you're saying, based on the assessment and the conversations we've been having, what is getting in the way of you achieving this long-term goal that is so important to you? Why can't you just go out and do it tomorrow? And what prevents you from doing it on your own, right? That you might benefit from XYZ service at a particular provider. And when those things are documented, whether they're documented in the body of the plan or in the assessment, I always encourage people to use highly descriptive material there, because the more descriptive you are in describing your barriers or some of the functional impairments, the easier it's going to be to write a really good quality, smart, short-term goal, okay? So say, for example, this is a person who more than anything, they wanted to be able to keep their apartment in the community. And instead of saying they have anger issues, which could look like a million different things, maybe they've been having outbursts and conflicts with their neighbors, and that's creating problems on the home front. Or instead of just saying they have depressive symptoms, maybe they have a housing voucher and they're so severely depressed they don't have the energy to take care of basic household tasks. Maybe they even have a housing inspection coming up as part of the voucher program, right? And they have to at least have basic sanitary conditions in the residential space, okay? So this just gives you an example, again, of how you sort of tighten up the barriers, both so that you have the substance that you need to write a good short-term goal, which we're going to segue to next. But also, this is a reminder for the person about why you're focusing on these things, right? As a clinician, I'm not just talking to you about anger and depression or difficulty with substances, because that's what I get paid to do. But because, as you can see on the right, you keep saying that these things are actually tripping you up and they're getting you into trouble with the landlord and you're at risk of being evicted. So this is why we're working on these things, to get you to that long-term goal that's so important to you. So then we have to transition to the short-term goal. This is what some of you may call the objective, or some of the providers may call an objective, okay? So basically, what we're coaching in this logic model is that you got to pick a barrier from that list, and what is going to be the proof that that thing is getting better, okay? That's what we refer to as the short-term goal, or again, some of you may call it the objective. It's like, what reasonable concrete steps, right, that are going to hit our SMART criteria, which I'll go over, that's going to make you feel like you're moving in the right direction, okay? So first of all, what are these? What's a definition? Short-term goals and objectives. So they're focused on the short-term, interim, concrete changes, right? Changes in a person's daily routine, things they can do differently, new experiences that they can enjoy. It's really the short-term benefits of their hard work, right? So that things are getting better. They divide that longer term, what can feel like sometimes an unmanageable long-term goal, into those first concrete steps. And like I was saying, in that sense, they're kind of proof that the person is getting closer, right? So if any of you are like me, I'm kind of obsessed with my to-do list, and I even use a lot of Post-its still. And when I'm feeling particularly overwhelmed with the bigger picture, if I'm just like crossing the smaller tasks off the list, it gives me a sense of accomplishment And it kind of fuels me to keep going to the next level, right? Because it sends a hopeful message that things are going in the right direction. And they can and will be different for the better in a pretty short amount of time, okay? So here's your SMART criteria. And there's a little bit of debate across the country. Sometimes people will say that the letters stand for slightly different things, but conceptually they come back to, concretely, is your short-term goal written in a way that if you read it out loud, are you going to know definitively, was it achieved or was it not? Okay, so you want it to be simple and straightforward. Is it a new skill, a new behavior? It has to be concrete and measurable, right? How is the progress measured? If somebody's struggling with social isolation, that may be a matter of concretely measuring, can they get to the grocery store and strike up a conversation with the cashier? Somebody else whose isolation is bordering on being homebound and struggling with something like agoraphobia, they may just be going out to the mailbox once a day, right? So it depends on where the person's starting. The A is for the attainable, right? So what is the first doable first step? You want it to be ambitious enough that it feels meaningful to a person, but not so ambitious that it's too much of a stretch, because you kind of want to program for success. You want it to have a time frame or a target date. So do you want a person to be able to do, they want to be able to do something one time in the next 90 days? Or I often encourage consecutive display of the new behavior or the activity. So maybe someone's going to do something each week for the next 90 days or the next 6 months, because then they're building that sense of continuity, and you have a better sense that that skill is going to generalize and it's going to stick and be sustainable. And then finally, the R, there's a little bit of debate. Some people will say realistic, but there's a lot of conceptual overlap between realistic and attainable. So increasingly, what we talk about is it relevant? Meaning, are you targeting a barrier that is genuinely interfering with the person's life in a way that is distressing to them? So the example I often use here is, say you're supporting someone who is struggling with self-care or hygiene because of disability issues or depression. Okay. If that person's long-term person-centered goal is that they want to get a job and work in customer service, well, then they need to present well for a job interview, and they need to present well when they're interacting with members of the public at their job. So that would be a relevant short-term goal to target. However, if you have another person, say they're like a stay-at-home grandmother and they live with their kids and their grandkids, and so maybe they're babysitting and doing childcare for the grandkids while the daughter works. But those grandkids don't care if grandma showers a minimum of 3 times a week over the next 90 days, right? It's not as relevant, okay? In that kind of an example, you'd want to be thinking about a relative short-term goal, something like, can the person safely cook lunch or macaroni and cheese on the stove for the kids without creating a fire hazard? Can she safely retrieve the kids from the bus stop? Does she know the steps in calling 911 if there was an emergency? So those would be kind of the relevant things to target. So the key thing to remember, we're applying SMART at the level of the short-term goal or objective. That's where you're looking for your measurability, okay? And it's going to tighten up your medical necessity and your responsiveness to the assessment, because we're targeting the barriers that have come up, okay? All right, let me do a few more slides on this, and then I'll check questions and we'll do a poll. I'll check the chat. So here's just a technical formula to tighten up the components of your SMART short-term goals, especially if you're struggling with meeting the SMART criteria. I often coach this rhythm. Within what amount of time is the person going to have an improvement in which barrier? So there's your tie back to your documentation of your assessed needs or your functional impairments, as evidenced by what meaningful change in functioning or behavior right? That's going to get them closer to their long-term goal. So I gave you a couple of examples at the bottom. The top one, John, was somebody that I worked with in New York City years ago, and he wanted to keep his job. It was very important to him, but he had pretty severe panic disorder, and it would often get triggered riding the public transportation system. And so he would frequently be late, or he would miss work because he would have a panic attack and he would go home, or he would be late. So we pulled that barrier out of the list. And we said at the level of the short-term goal, within the next 30 days, he's going to have improved management of the panic, as evidenced by what concrete measurable change. He's going to successfully ride the subway to work without exiting the train before his stop. Okay. So again, there could have been other examples. I'm just trying to offer you a few. All right. Short-term goals, your short-term objectives. They should not be about service participation. This is probably the #1 quality flaw I see in the documentation. Sometimes we do a nice job with the long-term goal. I want to get my kids back, have a place of my own, go to church on Sunday. But then I drop down to the level of the short-term goal, and everything says Janice will attend therapy, Janice will see the behavior specialist, Janice will meet with the psychiatrist. All of those things are an important part of the plan potentially, but those are not the short-term goal. Those things I just mentioned, therapy, behavior specialists, psychiatrists, those are interventions. And people can faithfully participate in interventions for years and still not get better, right? That's the tragedy of that. You know, we really want to be careful not to default to service participation, because people can participate forever and not achieve the desired results. You got to write your short-term goals in a way that we're checking, is all the services and the action steps coming together to help the person move forward. So as one example here, say you're working with a trauma survivor, and one of the things they struggle with is they're using self-injury and cutting to manage really intense emotions. And this person, Wanda, had been married and separated from her husband very briefly because he ultimately got pretty burned out from this, the self-injurious behavior. The team did a nice job of assessing, I want to repair my, relationship with my husband. And that was the long-term goal. But then when you drop down to the short-term goal, the short-term goal is not attend cognitive behavioral therapy. It's not attend trauma therapy. That's the intervention. You have to ask yourself, if Wanda goes to the cognitive behavioral therapy or the trauma therapy, what new skills are they going to learn to change their behavior? And in this case, the behavior and the new skill was maybe applying mindfulness to decrease the instances of self-injury, to no more than 1 instance per week for the next 90 days. And you would scale that up or back depending on where someone's starting. But the key thing here, I always tell people when you're reading your short-term goals, if you start seeing the words will attend, I say strike those from your language, because that almost always means that you're defaulting to service participation. So let me check my chat to see if we have questions about the short-term goals, and then we'll finish on the interventions. Okay. There's some great comments in the chat, by the way, now that I'm getting a chance to look at them. Okay. Okay, so I think we hit some of these questions already. Let me do this. Let me go ahead. Ingrid, can you open up our Jerry short-term goal? Again, remember, we're looking, his big goal is, I want a girlfriend, right? He wants somebody to share his life with. Now we're going to pick a short-term SMART goal. Pick the one you think that is the best. These are all anonymous, by the way. Maybe I should have said that. These are all anonymous, so please feel free to go ahead and vote. All right, a few more seconds. All right, Ingrid, go ahead and close it. We have some good diversity of responses, and if you can share the results. All right, so we definitely have a clear front runner here, okay? So he's going to participate in at least one, social activity, preferred social activity that he chooses, right? Each week outside the group home for the next 90 days, right? So we're overcoming that isolation and fear of others. The top one, a case manager referral, could be an important part of a plan, but again, case manager referral is an intervention, right? It's not the actual desired life change. Desired life change is getting them out of the group home and getting them out and about mobile in the community so he can be social, okay? Same thing with the blue one, the social skills group. Again, that's an intervention. And then finally, I'll just say the one on the bottom, Jerry is going to pay his cable bill on time each month for the next 3 months. So that's a nice example potentially of a smart short-term goal, but it probably belongs under a different long-term goal. Remember, what we're working on here is the I want a girlfriend, kind of like the social sphere, okay? So this one, again, in the gray that the vast majority of people chose is really the most ideal here. So let me close that and finish off with interventions. So again, we're progressing through our suggested template. And our interventions and our action steps. This is where I want you to think about the PCP is really a tool of accountability, okay? And more so than any part of the plan, the interventions and the action steps really outline that accountability, like who is going to do what by when to help the identified person to reach their short-term and their long-term person-centered goal, okay? So we are going to be incorporating our very best of our evidence-based practices, as well as innovative, recovery-oriented, alternative strategies. Evidence-based practices are great, but they're not the only game in town. So we want to, again, continue to make sure we're supporting individual choice and preference. And how you write these, there's some important ways for how you need to write them to support your medical necessity and your justification for care, okay, and services and payment. So for those of you, again, I know most of you, if not all of you, operate in this world where you have to be thinking ahead also about funder requirements and medical necessity. So trying to illustrate for you how you can meet those pressures within the context of one good quality plan that still honors the person. So with your professional billable interventions, right? Clinical, rehabilitative, group supports, behavior supports, medical supports. I talk about the key W's. Who's providing it? Ideally by name, if possible, or job title, because we recognize in certain modalities, things like assertive community treatment, it might not always be the same individual, but it might always be the team nurse, for example, or the team peer specialist. So who's providing it? What exactly is the short name of the service they're providing? Is it individual therapy, relapse prevention, positive behavior support management? When, so the schedule, right? So is it, one time a week for 90 days, or is it one time every 90 days? And then finally, just a tiny bit about why, meaning what is the individualized intent and purpose of that service for that individual? It doesn't have to be lengthy, but it's an important opportunity to connect the dots back for the person. So let me just give you an example, and then we'll close by reflecting on Jerry in a second here. So John Perkins, maybe he's a rehab specialist, or maybe you have peer specialists providing these supports, is providing what? Community integration support when? At least one time a week for the next 6 months. Why? Individualized intent and purpose to help them coach and practice skills necessary to use the public transportation access system. Okay, who, what, when, why, okay? In your interventions, if you are not the person providing the direct support, if you're not a clinician, if you're not a peer supporter, a rehabilitation specialist, maybe you're in a care coordination function, the language of your interventions is often going to look a little bit different. You're going to be using more terms like referring, monitoring, coordinating, etc., as opposed to your direct support providers who are teaching, coaching, practicing. It's more hands-on. So again, so just some examples here for you. Care coordination with the primary care doctor and the dentist within the next 2 weeks to prepare for the upcoming oral surgery and ensure the necessary blood work and health testing is completed. Who, what, when, why, okay? And finally, remember that a good quality PCP is not complete with only the professional interventions, okay? Yes, that's what providers get paid to deliver, but you want to build a sense of agency within the person or family, and also you want to help them build their natural supporters. So in the guidance document, there are also fields for you to identify a personal, self-directed action, as well as any contributions a natural supporter might make, okay? So say someone, the example here, they want to play guitar at an open mic night. Like that's their long-term goal that they're working toward. And maybe they're feeling really anxious, so you're supporting them with medication around that, or different therapies or coping strategies. But maybe the one thing that they're doing is maybe they're watching YouTube, guitar tutorials and kind of playing around, jamming at home at night. So it's just something that sends a message that, they're a part of this too. In fact, they're in the driver's seat. And so we want to use this field to kind of activate the person. And I've given you some other examples there. Same kind of thing with the natural support actions. Say somebody's working on going back to church, to their preferred faith community. You maybe help them in lots of ways as professionals to manage disability-related things that get in the way. But maybe you can reach out to Father Cronin, the priest in Hilda's parish, to help arrange rides to and from Sunday services. So before we have a rehab coordinator, a social worker transporting people, we have to really think outside the box. Who else is out there that could assist with this, or that we could make a connection with so that they can build their natural support network over time? Okay. All right. Last poll here. We're going to go ahead and open this one. This one's a little different. We're choosing Jerry's PCP intervention. And if you were working with Jerry, co-creating a plan, what do you think would be the best? And in this case, intentional, you're allowed to do 2 choices on this one. So go ahead and vote. All right, Ingrid, you can go ahead and close it just so I can make sure I can get us through the rest of our. All right. So we've got a couple of overwhelming winners here. And I would say that you all picked the best options. First, in the gray, we have an example of a really nicely written professional intervention, right? You have the John Smith, the peer residential coach. He's doing some travel training 1 time a week for 4 weeks to help Jerry build his skills to get around in the community. So he can actually use the bus to get downtown, to get to the Dunkin' Donuts, okay? But remember, we also want the person to be activated, and also if they have any natural supporters. So down the bottom, we've got the really nice one in green, which is an example of how his brother might pitch in. And Jerry doesn't want to go to these things alone. He wants kind of a wingman in the beginning, okay? So until Jerry's more comfortable, the brother is going to accompany him. And just keep in mind, as I share with you a snippet of Jerry's plan, this is an excerpt in Jerry's plan. This sample is going to be in your slides when you get it. But hopefully what you can see here, we stay true and start with, this is the plan we built together over the course of the webinar today. I really want a girlfriend. I want somebody to share my life with. I have a bunch of different strengths and interests that I can draw upon to help me move in that direction. But then I've also got a lot of struggles associated with my experience of mental health issues. They're causing me a lot of distress and getting in the way there. And you see those detailed there, including with some descriptive language, including identifying difficulty getting disorganized on public bus routes, becoming fearful of other people when he's using public transportation. So for those of you who are concerned about the balance in the documentation, you continue to have places within your assessment and your PCP where you're still being very descriptive about what is getting in the way. And you see that here. Then we say, well, what's one of the first steps you can take, Jerry? That's going to help you feel like you're getting back out there, getting more social again. And first and foremost, we had to, again, this was somebody I worked with years ago. His story is modeled on that. If you're only coming to the mental health center once every couple of weeks to see me, that's not going to expand your social horizon. So let's work on getting you out of the house in one chosen social activity each week for the next 90 days. Then we put together a set of services, who, what, when, and why, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy, medication management, the travel training identified, here's how Brother Jim can help. And then finally, Jerry continued to be concerned about that zombie-like feeling. So what he wanted to do was he was going to keep a very basic log on his calendar, how he was feeling as his doctor adjusted his medications to kind of get a sense if that was a side effect of medication, or maybe, again, it was just a part of the struggle of the illness that he was experiencing, that kind of lethargy, inability to initiate. So hopefully what you see by ending with the example is that we can honor the person, and still there are many places where we can do our professional due diligence and make sure we're tying back to the assessment and the barriers and things that are getting in the way, and continue to weave that golden thread of medical necessity. And since I covered a ton on today's webinar, I wanted to leave you with lots of tools and resources here. So Ingrid's going to drop into the chat our recovery roadmap PCP documentation. It's like a tickle list. So how do I know a good plan when I see it? And folks have responded really positively to this because it offers very concrete plan indicators as well as some examples. So we wanted you to have that. Hopefully this is leaving you in a more optimistic place that you can support providers in honoring the person and satisfying the chart. This is really central in our person-centered partnerships with people to help them build good lives in the community as they define them.